There is a moment, somewhere around 48 BCE, when a small boat pushes off from the eastern shore of the Egyptian coast in the dark. Inside it, wrapped in what the sources variously describe as a sack or a rolled carpet, is the Queen of Egypt. She is 21 years old. She has been driven out of her own capital by her younger brother's advisors, who control the boy king and intend to keep controlling him. She has spent months on the eastern border assembling an army she cannot yet deploy. And now, learning that Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in the Roman world, has arrived in Alexandria, she has made a calculation that will shape the next 2 decades of Mediterranean history. She is going to smuggle herself past her enemies and place herself directly in front of him before anyone can stop her. What happens when she does is one of the great pivots of the ancient world. But to understand why it worked, why Caesar listened, why Antony later came, why Octavian feared her enough to make sure she never reached Rome alive, you have to understand what she actually was. Not the figure that 2,000 years of painting and poetry produced, the real one. A trained sovereign who spoke 9 languages, governed a kingdom of 8 million people, understood finance and theology and military logistics, and spent her entire reign doing something extraordinarily difficult: keeping Egypt independent in a world that Rome was systematically absorbing. This is the full story of Cleopatra VII, the last ruler of the Ptolemaic dynasty, the last pharaoh of an independent Egypt, and the woman who came closer than anyone else in the ancient world to checking the expansion of Rome. If this kind of deep historical storytelling is what you come here for, consider subscribing to Quiet Chronicles. We publish a new long-form history every week. A like also helps this story reach people who haven't found the channel yet. Now, to understand the woman in that boat, you have to understand the city she was trying to get back into, and the dynasty that built it. Chapter 1: The City at the Mouth of Everything. To understand Cleopatra, you have to start with the city, because Alexandria was not simply where she was born and ruled. It was the argument her dynasty had been making for 2.5 centuries. The argument that the center of the civilized world had shifted, that it no longer lived in Athens or Persia or anywhere that had come before, that it lived here on a narrow strip of land between the Mediterranean Sea and a freshwater lake at the northwestern edge of the Nile Delta, in a city that had been planned from scratch and built by will alone. Alexandria in the 1st century BCE was home to somewhere approaching 500,000 people. That made it the 2nd largest city in the Mediterranean world, behind Rome and ahead of everywhere else. Its streets ran on a grid, unusual for ancient cities, which typically accumulated their shape over centuries of organic growth. Alexandria had been designed. You could see it in the layout: 2 main boulevards crossing at right angles, wide enough for 2 carts to pass side by side with room left over, flanked by colonnades that provided shade in summer and shelter in winter. The city had been thought about before it existed, which gave it a quality that older cities lacked: a coherence, a sense of intention made permanent in stone. The harbor was its engine, or rather, the 2 harbors were the Great Harbor to the east and the Eunostos to the west, separated by a long artificial mole called the Heptastadion that connected the mainland to the island of Pharos, roughly 7 stades offshore. On Pharos stood the lighthouse, one of the 7 wonders of the ancient world, rising somewhere in the range of 100 meters above the water. Ancient sources describe a fire burning at its top that was visible from the sea at distances that seem implausible until you account for how flat and dark the surrounding coastline was. Ships navigating the eastern Mediterranean at night steered by it. The lighthouse was not decorative. It was infrastructure, a signal that said, "Here is the port, here is the city, here is where the grain is." The grain mattered enormously. Egypt's agricultural base, the Nile Delta and the narrow cultivated strip running south along the river, produced surplus wheat on a scale that the ancient world found almost difficult to believe. The annual flood deposited fresh silt across the fields. The soil recovered year after year without the exhaustion that plagued dryland farming elsewhere, and the result was a breadbasket that fed not only Egypt's 8 million people, but a substantial portion of Rome as well. By the 1st century BCE, Rome had grown to a size that it could not feed from Italian soil alone, and Egyptian grain moving through Alexandria's harbor was not a luxury. It was a structural dependency. The city at the mouth of the Nile had, in this way, a kind of leverage over the city on the Tiber that neither side spoke about directly, but both understood perfectly well. Into this harbor came the trade of the known world. Goods moved through Alexandria from sub-Saharan Africa, from Arabia, from India via the Red Sea route that Ptolemaic merchants had been developing for generations. Ivory, spices, silk, papyrus. Papyrus especially, since Egypt's marshes produced the plant and Alexandria's craftsmen had developed the processing technology, and the entire literate Mediterranean ran on Egyptian writing material. The city took a percentage of everything that passed through it, and over 2 centuries this had produced an accumulated wealth that made the Ptolemaic treasury the richest in the world outside Rome itself. At the center of all this, in the northeastern quarter of the city closest to the great harbor, sat the royal complex, a sprawling collection of palaces, gardens, courtyards, and administrative buildings that occupied perhaps 1/3 of the city's total area. The Ptolemaic kings and queens had been adding to it for generations, each ruler constructing new wings and annexes, so that by Cleopatra's time it had the quality of a city within the city, a place where the business of governance, the rituals of royal display, and the private life of the dynasty all occurred within the same enormous walled precinct. It was from here that Egypt was administered. It was here that Cleopatra was born, probably in 69 BCE, into a family that had been ruling this city and this kingdom for 250 years. That family was the Ptolemaic dynasty, and to understand them properly requires setting aside almost everything that the word Egyptian might suggest. The Ptolemies were not Egyptian. They were Macedonian, descendants of one of Alexander the Great's generals, a man named Ptolemy who had served Alexander across the campaigns that dismantled the Persian Empire and pushed Greek-speaking power to the edges of India. When Alexander died in Babylon in 323 BCE without a clear successor, his empire fragmented among his generals in a series of wars that lasted for decades. Ptolemy was shrewd enough to secure Egypt early and hold it, and shrewd enough also to do something that gave his dynasty its founding legitimacy. He acquired Alexander's body. This was not a sentimental act. Alexander's corpse, moving in its funeral cortege from Babylon toward Macedonia, was intercepted by Ptolemy's forces somewhere in Syria and redirected to Egypt. The body eventually came to rest in Alexandria, in a tomb that became one of the city's defining monuments, a place of pilgrimage for centuries, visited by Julius Caesar himself when he arrived in the city in 48 BCE. Ptolemy understood that whoever held Alexander's remains held the most powerful legitimizing relic in the post-conquest world. Alexander had been not merely a conqueror, but something approaching a god in the eyes of the Greek-speaking world he had created, and physical proximity to him transferred a portion of that sacred authority. The dynasty that possessed his body was, in some sense, his heir. From this foundation, the Ptolemies built a state of extraordinary sophistication. They governed Egypt through a Greek-speaking administrative class. The bureaucracy ran in Greek. The courts operated in Greek. The official correspondence moved in Greek, while simultaneously engaging with the Egyptian religious and priestly establishment in terms those institutions recognized and respected. Ptolemaic rulers took Egyptian royal titles. They built and restored Egyptian temples. They presented themselves, in the formal iconographic language of the temple walls, as pharaohs in the traditional mode, making offerings to the gods in the postures that Egyptian art had used for 3,000 years. This dual identity, Macedonian Greek in the palace, Pharaonic Egyptian in the temple, was not hypocrisy. It was governance. Egypt's population was overwhelmingly Egyptian. Its religious institutions were ancient and deeply rooted, and a dynasty that ignored those institutions would have governed on sand. The Mausoleum and the library were the dynasty's intellectual monument. The mausoleum, from which the modern word museum derives, was a research institution attached to the royal court, housing scholars on royal stipend who were free to pursue their work without the need to earn a living elsewhere. The library that adjoined it aimed at something that sounds simple and was in practice almost impossible: a copy of every significant text in the Greek-speaking world. Agents were sent to collect manuscripts. Ships arriving in Alexandria's harbor were reportedly boarded and their books confiscated for copying before being returned. The collection grew over generations to several 100,000 scrolls, the largest concentration of written knowledge the ancient world had assembled. Mathematicians, physicians, geographers, poets, and astronomers all worked here. Euclid developed his geometry in Alexandria. Eratosthenes calculated the circumference of the earth here with an accuracy that would not be bettered for centuries. This was the world into which Cleopatra was born. Not the romantic Egypt of popular imagination, the Egypt of pyramids and desert mystery, but this, a cosmopolitan, multilingual, commercially ferocious Mediterranean metropolis run by a Macedonian dynasty that had mastered the art of being two things at once. Greek enough for the scholars and the merchants, Egyptian enough for the priests and the farmers, and rich enough that the distinction barely mattered most of the time. But by the time of her birth, cracks had been running through the foundation for a long time. The Ptolemaic dynasty in the 2nd and 1st centuries BCE was not the confident, expansionist power it had been in its 1st century. The wars among Alexander's successors had gradually stripped away Ptolemaic territory outside Egypt itself. Cyrenaica, Cyprus, the Ptolemaic holdings in the Aegean, these had been lost or contested repeatedly. The dynasty's internal politics had grown progressively more brutal, with siblings killing siblings and mothers killing sons in a pattern of dynastic violence that had become almost routine. And looming over everything, growing larger with every decade, was Rome. Rome in the 1st century BCE was in the process of absorbing the Mediterranean world, not always through direct conquest, sometimes through the more subtle mechanism of declaring a kingdom's ruler a friend and ally of the Roman people, a status that sounded like an honor and functioned like a leash. Egypt had been in this position for decades. Its independence was technically intact, its rulers theoretically sovereign, but Roman businessmen operated in Alexandria. Roman political figures expected Egyptian cooperation, and the question of whether Egypt would eventually be formally annexed was not whether, but when and under what circumstances. Cleopatra grew up inside this tension. She was one of several children of the reigning king Ptolemy XII, a man whose entire career had been shaped by the effort to manage Egypt's relationship with Rome on terms that preserved some vestige of Egyptian autonomy. What that effort cost him, and what it ultimately cost her, is where this story truly begins. Because Ptolemy XII was about to make a decision that would mortgage Egypt's future to pay for its present. He was going to go to Rome hat in hand and buy his own legitimacy, and the price he agreed to pay would still be coming due when his daughter sat on the throne a decade later. Chapter 2: A Court Built on Roman Credit. The debt began with a number, 6,000 talents. To put that in context, 6,000 talents was roughly equivalent to Egypt's entire annual revenue. It was not a loan a government takes to fund an infrastructure project or smooth a temporary shortfall. It was the sum a king pays when he has run out of options. It was the cost to purchase something that should not, in any legitimate political order, be for sale. What Ptolemy XII was buying with it was Roman recognition. It was the formal acknowledgement by the Senate that he was the rightful king of Egypt, that his throne was legitimate, and that Rome would not be annexing his kingdom in the immediate future. That he needed to buy this at all tells you everything about how far the Ptolemaic position had deteriorated. The crisis had been building since 80 BCE. This was when the previous Ptolemaic king died without a clear, legitimate heir, and Rome briefly considered simply absorbing Egypt outright. The Senate ultimately held back. The political moment was not right. The logistics were complicated, and there were powerful Roman figures who preferred a dependent Egyptian monarchy to the administrative burden of a new province. But the fact that the question had been asked at all, seriously and at the highest levels of Roman government, was a signal that could not be ignored. Egypt's independence was no longer a given. It was a political condition that had to be actively maintained. Maintaining it required Roman goodwill, and Roman goodwill had a price. Ptolemy XII understood this with uncomfortable clarity. He had come to the throne in approximately 80 BCE himself, under circumstances that were contested. His legitimacy was questioned within Egypt, and Rome had not formally recognized him for the better part of 2 decades. He spent those decades in a state of anxious suspension, watching Rome consume the kingdoms around him. In 74 BCE, Rome annexed Cyrenaica, the territory directly to his west. In 64 BCE, Pompey reorganized Syria and made it a Roman province. In 58 BCE, Rome annexed Cyprus, the island that had been Ptolemaic territory, governed by Ptolemy XII's own brother. His brother, rather than submit, killed himself. Ptolemy XII said nothing publicly. He could not afford to. That silence cost him his throne, temporarily. The Alexandrians had been watching their king's studied passivity toward Roman encroachment with growing contempt. A king who would not defend his own brother's kingdom was not, in Alexandrian political terms, a king worth keeping. In 58 BCE, the city rose against him, and Ptolemy XII fled. He did not go to raise an army or seek allies among the eastern kingdoms. He went to Rome. He went to the city that had been dismantling his family's world and asked it to put him back on his throne. The embassy he conducted in Rome between 58 and 55 BCE was one of the more humiliating episodes in Ptolemaic history. It was conducted in full view of Rome's political class. He spent his time cultivating the men who mattered. Julius Caesar, who had recently completed his consulship and was preparing for his Gallic campaigns, and Pompey, whose eastern settlements had reshaped the Mediterranean. He borrowed heavily from a Roman businessman named Gaius Rabirius Postumus. This man became his primary creditor and would later follow him back to Egypt to recover the investment. He lobbied, he waited, he paid. Eventually, he secured what he needed: a Roman military force under the general Aulus Gabinius that marched into Egypt in 55 BCE and restored him to his throne by force. The soldiers Gabinius brought were not sent home afterward. They stayed, a garrison force of Roman and Germanic troops known as the Gabiniani. They were quartered in Alexandria, nominally in Ptolemy XII's service, but answering ultimately to Roman interests. Their presence was a physical reminder, visible every day in the city's streets, of exactly what kind of independence Egypt actually had. Back in Alexandria during her father's 3-year absence, the court had continued functioning under Ptolemy XII's eldest daughter, Berenice IV. She had ruled with reasonable competence, enough at least to keep the kingdom from fragmenting. But she had made the mistake of believing the situation was permanent rather than temporary. When Ptolemy XII returned with Gabinius's soldiers at his back, Berenice IV had nowhere to go. He had her executed within weeks. The sources are brief about the specifics. She was strangled, most likely. She was his daughter, and he killed her to secure his throne. The Alexandrian court absorbed this piece of information and continued operating, because this was the kind of thing Ptolemaic courts did. Cleopatra was approximately 14 years old when her father returned. She had been in Alexandria through the exile. She was old enough to have watched her sister govern and understood what the Gabiniani's arrival meant. She would have been present, or near present, for the execution of Berenice. She would have seen the Roman soldiers settle into their quarters in the city, and she would have begun to understand the nature of the world she had been born into. It was a world in which Roman power was not an external threat, but an internal presence, in which her father's legitimacy had been purchased rather than inherited. The treasury that should have funded Egypt's administration was instead bleeding talent to service a debt that could never quite be fully repaid. Rabirius Postumus had in fact been given the position of royal finance minister as part of the repayment arrangement. This meant that a Roman creditor was now formally managing the financial administration of the Egyptian state. This was not occupation in the traditional sense. It was something more insidious, a dependency so structural that it was difficult to identify where Egyptian governance ended and Roman financial control began. Ptolemy XII ruled for another 5 years after his restoration, dying in 51 BCE. During those years, Cleopatra was being prepared for succession in a way that distinguished her from virtually every Ptolemaic ruler in recent history. She learned languages, Greek naturally as the court's primary tongue, but also Egyptian, which no Ptolemaic ruler had bothered to learn in nearly 3 centuries. She reportedly learned several others: Aramaic, Hebrew, Ethiopian, and Parthian. Ancient sources record this linguistic capacity as one of her notable characteristics. She could move through a conversation in multiple tongues without an interpreter, which was unusual enough in the ancient world to be remarked upon. She also engaged with the Egyptian priestly establishment in a way her predecessors had not. The Ptolemies had always used Egyptian religious forms for political purposes, built temples, maintained the cults, appeared in the proper iconographic postures. But this had generally been managed at a distance, through intermediaries, as a matter of policy rather than personal involvement. Cleopatra appears to have gone further, cultivating genuine relationships with the temple institutions. She learned the religious forms from the inside rather than deploying them from above. Whether this reflected personal conviction or political calculation is a question the sources cannot fully answer. What is clear is that by the time Ptolemy XII died and left her the throne, she was not an untested girl. She was a trained ruler who had been watching her father navigate the most difficult political environment in the dynasty's history. She had seen what Roman dependency looked like from the inside. She had watched a competent sister lose her head for failing to anticipate her father's return. She had observed the Gabiniani in the city streets for 5 years. She took the throne at 18 with a clearer understanding of the world she was governing than most rulers acquire in a decade. But the inheritance she received was not a stable kingdom waiting to be well governed. It was a fragile structure sitting on a cracked foundation, with debts still outstanding and Roman soldiers still quartered in the city. A 10-year-old brother was installed as her co-ruler by their father's will. The court was full of men who had already demonstrated that they were perfectly capable of replacing a monarch who no longer served their purposes. The co-regency with Ptolemy XIII was not a partnership. It was a time bomb. The men surrounding her brother were already calculating how long they would need to wait. They were waiting to do to Cleopatra what Cleopatra's father had done to her sister. What they had not accounted for was how quickly she would move to make herself indispensable, and what she was willing to do to stay that way. Chapter 3: The Weight of What Was Owed. The kingdom Cleopatra inherited in 51 BCE had a surface of magnificence and an interior of strain. From the outside, Egypt still looked like what it had always been, the wealthiest state in the eastern Mediterranean, the granary of the ancient world, a kingdom whose capital city contained more scholars, more merchants, and more accumulated treasure than almost anywhere else on earth. The harbor still moved grain. The library still housed its hundreds of thousands of scrolls. The royal palace complex still occupied its enormous footprint along the northeastern waterfront, its gardens running down to the sea, its administrative wings processing the paperwork of a state that governed 8 million people across a territory stretching from the Mediterranean coast to the first cataract of the Nile. But the treasury that funded all of this was not what it appeared. The debt to Rome, the 6,000 talents borrowed to fund Ptolemy XII's restoration, plus the accumulated interest, plus the ongoing cost of maintaining the Gabiniani garrison, had not been paid off. It had been partially serviced, restructured, and extended in the way that debts tend to be when the borrower cannot actually afford to repay them. Rabirius Postumus had spent his time as royal finance minister extracting what he could, and while he had eventually returned to Rome, having made himself sufficiently unpopular in Alexandria that his position became untenable, the financial obligations he represented had not departed with him. They remained woven into the structure of the kingdom's accounts, a permanent drag on the treasury's capacity to function. Ptolemy XII had also, in the final years of his reign, faced a natural disaster that compounded everything else. The Nile flood of 50 BCE was insufficient. In Egypt, the annual flooding of the Nile was not merely an agricultural event, but the structural basis of the entire economy. The flood deposited the fresh silt that replenished the fields, regulated the water supply for the irrigation systems, and determined whether the harvest would be adequate or deficient. A low flood meant thin silt deposits, reduced soil fertility, and a harvest that fell short of the kingdom's needs. The famine that followed a bad flood year could be managed through the state's grain reserves, but those reserves had to be large enough to cover the gap, and a treasury already under strain from debt service was not well positioned to maintain the reserve levels that proper famine management required. Papyri from this period, the administrative records that Egyptian bureaucrats generated in enormous quantities and that have survived in the dry climate of the Egyptian countryside, record the consequences in the flat language of official documentation. Grain distribution orders, requests from nomad administrators for emergency allocations, records of reduced rations in certain districts. The kingdom did not collapse, and mass starvation was averted, but the famine of 50 BCE was real, and its management expensive, and it arrived at precisely the moment when the treasury could least absorb the cost. Into this financial landscape, Cleopatra stepped at 18 and immediately demonstrated something that would define her entire reign. She was an administrator, not merely a figurehead. The Ptolemaic system of government was, by ancient standards, extraordinarily sophisticated. Egypt was divided into administrative districts called nomes, each governed by a strategos who reported to the royal court. The tax system was comprehensive and detailed. There were taxes on land, on trade, on specific industries, on the production of particular goods. The royal monopolies controlled the production and distribution of key commodities, including papyrus, linen, and certain oils. A network of royal scribes, accountants, and officials processed the information that kept this system running, generating the papyri that still survive in such numbers that modern historians can sometimes reconstruct the economic conditions of individual villages in the 1st century BCE. Cleopatra engaged with this system at a level of detail that surprised the people around her. She read the reports. She issued specific orders rather than general directives. She made herself accessible to petitioners in a way that Ptolemaic rulers, who typically maintained a formal distance from anyone outside the court elite, had not generally done. The Egyptian priestly establishment in particular received her attention. The temples were not merely religious institutions, but economic ones, controlling land, labor, and surplus production across the country. And a ruler who had genuine relationships with the priests had access to resources and loyalty that no purely administrative apparatus could provide. Her identification with Isis was central to this. Isis was not simply one goddess among many in the Egyptian religious system. She was the divine queen, the mother of Horus, the protector of the pharaonic order, the goddess who had gathered the scattered pieces of her murdered husband Osiris and restored him to life, whose power over death and renewal made her the most widely worshipped deity in the Egyptian world. A Ptolemaic queen who presented herself as Isis was claiming not just royal authority, but divine continuity, placing herself inside a symbolic order that Egyptians had understood and venerated for thousands of years. At the Temple of Hathor at Dendera, a relief survives to this day that shows Cleopatra in the formal posture of a pharaoh making offerings, the gestures precise, the iconographic details correct, the visual language entirely Egyptian rather than Greek. This was not produced for Greek audiences. It was produced for the Egyptian religious establishment, for the priests and the pilgrims who came to this temple, and its message was unambiguous. This queen was not a foreign ruler condescending to use local religious forms. She was a continuation of the pharaonic tradition, standing in the same posture, performing the same gestures, occupying the same symbolic position that every ruler of Egypt had occupied since the beginning of the dynastic period. The political logic was sound, but it required maintenance, constant engagement with the priestly class, attendance at the rite ceremonies, knowledge of the forms and their meanings. This was work, and Cleopatra did it. What made all of this more difficult was the co-regency. Ptolemy XIII was approximately 10 years old when they came to the throne together, which meant that for the first several years of the reign, he was not a political actor in any meaningful sense. He was a child, and the political agency nominally attached to his name belonged entirely to the men who surrounded him. 3 of those men dominated the court faction aligned with the young king: Pothinus, who served as his financial administrator and chief advisor, Achilles, who commanded the Egyptian army, and Theodotus, a rhetorician from Chios who served as the boy's tutor. This group had a clear interest in maintaining Ptolemy XIII's primacy over Cleopatra. Their power derived from his, and Cleopatra, with her administrative competence and her independent relationships with the priesthood and the nome administrators, represented a direct threat to their control. The tension was not immediate. In the first years of the co-regency, Cleopatra's name appeared before her brothers in official documents, the standard indication of senior status in Ptolemaic co-regencies. She governed actively. She managed the famine's aftermath, negotiated the grain distribution, maintained the relationships with Rome that her father's policy had made necessary. There is no record of open conflict in the first 2 or 3 years. But sometime around 49 BCE, something shifted. The exact sequence of events is not fully recoverable from the surviving sources. The administrative papyri stopped listing Cleopatra's name in the senior position, and then stopped listing her name at all. The court faction around Ptolemy XIII had moved against her, using whatever combination of financial pressure, military leverage, and political maneuvering the sources do not fully record. By late 49 or early 48 BCE, Cleopatra had been driven from Alexandria. She did not accept this quietly. She withdrew to the eastern frontier region, the area around Pelusium, near the border with the Sinai, and began assembling a mercenary force. She had resources, the relationships she had built with the nome administrators, access to the revenues of the territories she had governed directly, and the kind of personal loyalty that a ruler who actually engaged with the machinery of government tended to accumulate. She was building toward a military confrontation with her brother's forces when an event occurred that neither side had planned for and that would change everything. The Roman Civil War arrived on Egypt's doorstep. Julius Caesar and Pompey, the two most powerful men in the Roman world, had spent years circling each other in the complex political dance of the late Republic, and in 48 BCE that dance ended. Caesar crossed the Rubicon, Pompey fled Italy, and the two men met at the Battle of Pharsalus in Greece in August of 48 BCE. Caesar won decisively. Pompey, with his cause collapsed and his forces scattered, made a decision that seemed logical and proved fatal. He sailed for Egypt, where he had connections, where he had previously been welcomed, and where he expected the Ptolemaic court to provide him sanctuary while he regrouped. He was 58 years old, a former consul, a man who had reorganized the entire Eastern Mediterranean on Rome's behalf. He had every reason to believe that Egypt would receive him. He had not accounted for what Theodotus would say when the council debated the question of what to do with him. Theodotus's argument, as recorded by Plutarch, was coldly logical. Receive Pompey, and you make an enemy of Caesar, who has just won the war. Reject him, and you make an enemy of Pompey, who might recover. Kill him, and you remove the problem entirely while sending Caesar a message about where Egypt's loyalties lay. Dead men, Theodotus reportedly observed, do not bite. The council accepted this reasoning. And what happened next? On a small boat on the Egyptian shore, within sight of the kingdom he had hoped would save him, would bring Julius Caesar to Alexandria, set in motion the series of events that would determine Cleopatra's fate and ultimately reshape the entire Mediterranean world. But it would not go the way Ptolemy XIII's advisors expected. Not even close. Chapter 4: The Queen Who Spoke Egyptian. Before the boat carrying Pompey reached the shore, before Theodotus's logic played out in blood on the Egyptian beach, it is worth pausing on the woman waiting on the eastern frontier, because who Cleopatra actually was, as a ruler and as a mind, gets lost in what is about to happen to her. The popular image of Cleopatra is almost entirely a Roman construction. The Romans who wrote about her had reasons, political, literary, and psychological, to present her in specific ways, and those reasons had very little to do with accuracy. She was, in the Roman literary tradition that solidified after her death, primarily a seductress, a woman whose power over Caesar and Antony was erotic rather than political, whose influence was a form of enchantment rather than competence, whose story was fundamentally about what happens when a great man loses his judgment to a foreign woman. This was a useful story for Octavian, who needed to explain Antony's behavior in terms that did not implicate Rome's own political dysfunctions. It was a useful story for Roman poets, who found in her a conveniently exotic figure onto whom they could project anxieties about Eastern luxury, female power, and the corruption of Roman virtue. It was not, as far as the evidence allows us to reconstruct, a particularly accurate story. The Cleopatra who emerges from the non-Roman evidence, from the Egyptian papyri, from the temple inscriptions, from the administrative records of her reign, is something considerably more interesting and considerably less dramatic than the Roman portrait. She was a working ruler in the most literal sense, a woman who read the administrative reports from her nome governors, who issued detailed orders about grain distribution and tax collection, who engaged personally with the Egyptian priestly establishment in ways that required genuine knowledge of Egyptian religious forms rather than superficial familiarity with them. The linguistic capacity is the detail that most clearly separates her from her predecessors. The Ptolemies had governed Egypt for nearly 3 centuries in Greek, a language that the Egyptian majority population did not speak. The administrative apparatus ran in Greek at the top and translated downward. There were local scribes and officials who handled the interface between the Greek-speaking court and the Egyptian-speaking population, but the rulers themselves had never bothered to learn the language of the people they governed. Cleopatra did. Plutarch, who is not generally sympathetic to her, records this as a notable fact, that she could converse with Ethiopians, Hebrews, Arabs, Syrians, Medes, and Parthians in their own languages, and that she was the first of her line to learn Egyptian. He lists this as one of her distinguishing characteristics, separate from her physical appearance, which he describes as not extraordinary in itself, but animated by a quality of personality and intelligence that made it compelling. 9 languages, by Plutarch's count. The number may be slightly inflated by admiration or by the ancient tendency to round upward on impressive qualities, But the core claim that she was multilingual to an unusual degree is supported by the pattern of her reign. She negotiated directly with the Egyptian priests. She received petitions in multiple languages without translators. She conducted diplomacy with Eastern kingdoms in their own tongues. This was not a parlor trick. It was a governing tool, and she had invested years in acquiring it at a time when her Ptolemaic predecessors had seen no reason to bother. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera preserves one of the most direct pieces of evidence for how she presented herself to her Egyptian subjects. The temple itself is one of the best preserved ancient Egyptian temples, its walls still carrying the painted reliefs that were carved during Cleopatra's reign. And on the outer rear wall she appears in the standard pharaonic posture. The formal stance, the ritual gestures, the offerings presented to the goddess in exactly the visual language that 3,000 years of Egyptian religious art had established as correct and recognizable. She wears Egyptian dress. She holds the Egyptian ritual implements. The inscriptions identify her in Egyptian religious titles. This image was not made for Greek audiences. The Greeks in Alexandria, who formed the upper stratum of Ptolemaic society, visited different kinds of spaces: the Mausoleum, the Gymnasium, the Greek-style temples in the city. The Temple of Hathor at Dendera was an Egyptian institution, serving an Egyptian religious community, and the image of Cleopatra on its wall was a message addressed specifically to that community. The message was, "I am not a foreign queen using your forms as a political convenience. I am a pharaoh in the tradition you have always known." Whether the Egyptian population fully accepted this claim is a question the sources cannot definitively answer. But the effort was real, the investment was genuine, and the practical effects were visible. The Egyptian priestly class supported her reign in ways they had not consistently supported her predecessors, providing institutional loyalty that proved crucial during the crises of the next several years. The co-regency with Ptolemy XIII had, by the time of her expulsion, already begun to reveal its structural impossibility. A co-regency in the Ptolemaic system was never intended to be a genuine partnership of equals. It was a formal arrangement that distributed the titles of rule while concentrating its actual exercise in the senior partner. Cleopatra was the senior partner by age, by preparation, and by the evident quality of her engagement with the kingdom's administration. Ptolemy XIII was a child, and the men around him were using his name as a vehicle for their own authority. Pothinus was the most capable of the three and the most dangerous. He was the kingdom's financial administrator, eunuch, which in the Ptolemaic court carried no social stigma and often indicated a man who had risen through administrative rather than military channels, and he understood the kingdom's finances well enough to know how to use them as leverage. He controlled the flow of resources to and from the royal court, which meant he controlled, in practical terms, much of what the court could and could not do. His alliance with Achilles, who commanded the military, and Theodotus, who shaped the boy king's education and therefore his instincts, created a governing faction that had effectively captured the machinery of the Ptolemaic state. Cleopatra's removal from Alexandria was the logical outcome of this faction's interests, and she had likely seen it coming for months before it happened. The question was not whether they would move against her, but when and whether she would be positioned to respond. Her withdrawal to the eastern frontier was not a flight, it was a strategic repositioning. She went to the region she could hold, began building the force she would need, and waited for the moment to move. That moment arrived in the most unexpected form imaginable, in the late summer of 48 BCE. When the news reached the eastern frontier that Caesar had arrived in Alexandria, that he had sailed into the great harbor with a modest force, taken up residence in the royal palace, and received the preserved head of Pompey from Ptolemy XIII's representatives, Cleopatra understood immediately what it meant. Caesar was the most powerful man in the Roman world. His presence in Alexandria was not accidental. He had followed Pompey there, and now that Pompey was dead, he was in a position to settle Egypt's political situation on whatever terms suited him. Ptolemy XIII's advisors had killed Pompey expecting Caesar's gratitude. What they had not fully considered was that Caesar's gratitude was worth considerably less than his political interests, and his political interests in Egypt were not yet determined. There was a window. It was narrow, and it was closing. If Cleopatra could reach Caesar before her brother's advisors defined her to him, before Pothinus framed her as a rebel, a troublemaker, a deposed claimant whose removal had been in Egypt's interests, she might be able to present her own case directly. If she waited for conventional channels, for formal diplomatic approaches through intermediaries, Pothinus would intercept every one of them. She needed to be in the room with Caesar before anyone could stop her from getting there. The solution she arrived at was either an act of extraordinary boldness or a calculated gamble that had simply been thought through more carefully than it appeared. She found a Sicilian merchant named Apollodorus who was willing to carry her past the blockade that Ptolemy XIII's forces had placed around the palace. She crossed the water at night, and she arrived at Caesar's quarters inside a wrapped bundle, a merchant's sack in some sources, a rolled carpet or sleeping sack in others, that Apollodorus carried in as if delivering goods. When it was unrolled, Cleopatra was inside it. What Caesar made of this entrance in the first seconds after it happened, the sources do not record precisely. What they do record is that he listened to her, that he did not send her away, that by the time the night was over, he had decided to support her claim to the throne over her brothers. What she said to him in those hours, and what she understood about Caesar that made her confident she could persuade him, reveals more about her political intelligence than almost any other episode in her life. Chapter 5: The Sister, the Boy King, and the Severed Head. Pompey died badly. That is worth stating plainly, because the manner of his death, the specific, degrading mechanics of it, tells you something important about the political calculation that produced it, and about the world Cleopatra was navigating when she made her crossing to Caesar's quarters. Pompey the Great had been, for the better part of 2 decades, one of the 2 or 3 most powerful men in the Roman world. He had cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in a campaign of extraordinary efficiency. He had reorganized the entire Eastern Mediterranean on Rome's behalf, settling kingdoms, installing client rulers, and extending Roman influence from Syria to the Black Sea. He had been consul 3 times. He had celebrated 3 triumphs, the ceremonial processions through Rome that marked a general's greatest conquests, and the 3rd had been so elaborate that it lasted 2 days. He was 58 years old, a man of genuine historical magnitude, and he arrived on the Egyptian coast in September of 48 BCE in a small boat. He had just lost the battle that ended his cause, hoping that the kingdom he had helped restore would now help him. The Egyptian court sent a boat to meet him. In it were 3 men: Achilles, the military commander, a Roman soldier named Lucius Septimius, who had served under Pompey in his eastern campaigns, and whom Pompey therefore recognized as a familiar face, and a 3rd man whose name the sources record as Salvius. The boat was small, too small for a proper reception, which Pompey's advisors noted with unease. His wife Cornelia watched from the ship that had carried him, unable to accompany him into the smaller vessel. As Pompey stepped aboard and the boat moved toward shore, he turned to read from a small document, perhaps preparing remarks for his reception. Septimius stabbed him from behind. Achilles joined in. Pompey pulled his toga over his face, the gesture Romans used to die with dignity when death was unavoidable, and said nothing. His wife and his companions on the larger ship, watching from a distance too great to intervene, saw him fall. His head was severed and preserved. His body was left on the beach. When Caesar arrived in Alexandria 3 days later, and Theodotus presented him with Pompey's head as a gift, evidence of Egyptian loyalty, an offering intended to signal that the court had already taken Caesar's side, Caesar wept, or was reported to have wept. Plutarch records it, and Plutarch is not always reliable on emotional details, but the political meaning of the gesture was real regardless of Caesar's private feelings. He had not wanted Pompey dead. He had wanted him captured, pardoned, and politically neutralized. A living Pompey under Caesar's control was far more useful than a dead Pompey whose martyrdom could animate continued resistance. Theodotus had miscalculated. His cold logic had produced exactly the wrong gift. Caesar entered Alexandria with approximately 4,000 soldiers, a force adequate for most situations, but notably modest for a city of 500,000 people whose population did not particularly want Roman troops in their streets. He took up residence in the royal palace complex in the northeastern quarter of the city. He made clear that he intended to adjudicate the dispute between Cleopatra and Ptolemy XIII, framing this as a matter of honoring the treaty obligations Rome had with Egypt, specifically the terms under which Ptolemy XII had been recognized and restored, which had included provisions for the joint co-regency of his children. Ptolemy XIII's advisors recognized immediately that this was dangerous. An adjudication by Caesar was only useful to them if Caesar decided in their favor, and Caesar deciding in their favor required that he hear only their version of the situation before forming a judgment. They moved to control his information environment, keeping him occupied with formal receptions, managing the conversations around him, positioning Ptolemy XIII as the legitimate sole ruler and Cleopatra as a destabilizing rebel whose removal had been necessary for Egypt's stability. They were making reasonable progress with this strategy when Apollodorus's boat arrived at the palace waterfront after dark. The carpet story, or the linen sack story, depending on which source you follow, has attracted a great deal of literary attention over the centuries, most of it focused on its romantic drama. But the operational logic of it is what matters here. Cleopatra needed to reach Caesar in person, unannounced, before her brother's advisors could intercept her approach or frame her arrival as a threat. A formal approach by sea would have been visible and interceptable. A direct approach through the city on foot or by litter would have required passing through areas controlled by Ptolemy XIII's forces. Apollodorus, as a merchant with legitimate access to the palace precinct for commercial purposes, provided the only viable vector. The specific container, carpet, sack, or otherwise, was simply the mechanism for moving a person without appearing to move a person. It was a logistics problem solved by someone who was good at solving logistics problems. What happened when she emerged in Caesar's presence is one of those historical moments where the sources give you the outcome without the interior. Caesar decided to support her. That much is clear. The night-long conversation that preceded this decision is not recorded in any source that survives. What we can reconstruct is what she had to work with: her legal claim to the co-regency, which was genuine and which Rome's treaty obligations theoretically required Caesar to honor. She had her command of languages, which allowed her to speak to him without interpreters and therefore without any intermediary filtering what she said. Her understanding of Egypt's financial and strategic value to Rome, and whatever quality of personal intelligence and presence she possessed. She also had, to put it plainly, an accurate read of Caesar himself. Caesar at 48 was a man of considerable vanity alongside his genuine brilliance, a man who responded to being treated as exceptional because he was exceptional and knew it, and appreciated others knowing it. Cleopatra's entrance alone, the sheer audacity of it, would have spoken to something in him. This was not a woman who had sent emissaries or written letters. This was a woman who had calculated that the only way to make her case was to make it in person, at night, in a foreign palace, past a military blockade, wrapped in a merchant's bundle. Caesar, who had crossed the Rubicon against the explicit orders of the Senate, would have understood this kind of decision immediately. By morning, she was under Caesar's protection. Ptolemy XIII was summoned to the palace and presented with a situation his advisors had not anticipated and could not immediately reverse. Caesar had heard both sides and was prepared to enforce the terms of the co-regency. Ptolemy XIII, who was 13 years old, reportedly threw his crown to the ground in fury and ran from the palace into the city, shouting to the Alexandrian crowd that he had been betrayed. The crowd, which had its own complicated feelings about Roman troops in its streets and Roman adjudication of its dynasty's affairs, was receptive. The city's mood, already volatile, began to tip toward open hostility. Pothinus remained in the palace, outwardly cooperative, internally calculating. He sent messages to Achilles, who was with the Egyptian army outside the city. Those messages instructed Achilles to march on Alexandria with the full force under his command, somewhere between 20 and 27,000 infantry and 2,000 cavalry. The army that arrived at the city's edges was not a negotiating tool. It was an attempt to resolve by force what diplomacy had failed to prevent. Caesar found himself in an awkward position. His 4,000 soldiers were adequate for palace security. They were not adequate for a pitched engagement against an Egyptian army of that size in an unfamiliar urban environment. He was, in the technical military sense, trapped in a palace, in a hostile city, with insufficient force to fight his way out and insufficient ships to evacuate by sea. And into this situation walked another member of the Ptolemaic family, whose role in what followed would be complicated, consequential, and almost entirely forgotten by the tradition that fixed Cleopatra at the center of the story. Arsinoe IV was Cleopatra's younger sister. She was somewhere around 16 years old, and she had been watching the same crisis unfold from inside the palace with her own assessment of what it meant. What she did next would start a war and create a problem for Cleopatra that would not be fully resolved for another decade. Chapter 6: The War in the Palace City. Arsinoe IV walked out of the palace. That is the simplest way to describe what she did, and it contains the full weight of the decision. She was inside the royal complex, under Caesar's nominal protection alongside Cleopatra, in a situation where the sensible move, the move that minimized personal risk, was to remain where she was and wait for the military and political situation to resolve itself around her. Instead, sometime in the early weeks of the conflict that would become known as the Alexandrian War, she slipped away from the palace precinct and made her way to the Egyptian army outside the city. There, she did something more surprising still. She had herself proclaimed Queen of Egypt. The logic was not irrational, even if the execution was audacious to the point of recklessness. Ptolemy XIII was effectively Caesar's prisoner, summoned back to the palace after his street performance and kept there under the polite fiction of joint adjudication. Cleopatra was under Caesar's protection, which meant her authority derived from Roman military force rather than independent Egyptian legitimacy. Arsinoe, outside the palace and aligned with the Egyptian army, could present herself as the free Ptolemaic ruler, the one not constrained by Roman patronage, the one the Alexandrian population could support without also supporting Roman occupation. It was a genuine political argument, and the city's population, which had reasons of its own to resist Caesar's presence, was in a mood to hear it. Her general was Achilles, who commanded the army that had marched on Alexandria at Pothinus's instruction. The two of them, the teenage princess and the experienced military commander, made an uncomfortable alliance from the start. Achilles had his own agenda, his own relationships within the army, and his own ideas about who should be giving orders. Arsinoe, for her part, had the royal title and the symbolic legitimacy that Achilles needed to present the army's actions as something other than a military coup. They needed each other and trusted each other approximately as far as either could be useful. Caesar, meanwhile, was doing what Caesar did when confined to an inadequate defensive position. He was making the most of it with methodical efficiency. The royal palace complex gave him a defensible perimeter along the northeastern waterfront. He controlled the immediate harbor area. He had the island of Pharos, with its lighthouse, under observation, if not yet under control. What he needed urgently was reinforcement, additional troops marching overland from Roman-controlled territory to the east. And what he needed in the interim was to prevent the Egyptian fleet from sealing the harbor and cutting him off entirely from resupply by sea. The Egyptian fleet was the problem. It sat in the harbor, dozens of warships and transport vessels that, if Achilles' forces took control of them, would give the Egyptian side the ability to blockade Caesar completely. Caesar's solution was direct. He burned it. The fire that consumed the Egyptian fleet in the harbor of Alexandria in late 48 BCE is one of those historical events that accumulated additional significance in the telling. Ancient sources, writing decades and centuries after the fact, reported that the fire spread beyond the ships, that it reached the warehouses along the waterfront, and that among the things that burned was a large collection of books, possibly connected to the library. Later tradition inflated this into the destruction of the Library of Alexandria itself, one of history's great catastrophes. The reality is more complicated and less dramatic. The library was not a building on the waterfront. It was an institution attached to the mausoleum in the royal quarter, and it continued to function for centuries after the Alexandrian War. There are references to it in sources from the 2nd and 3rd centuries CE that treat it as an ongoing institution. What burned in the harbor was almost certainly a warehouse containing books, possibly books awaiting shipment, possibly part of a collection associated with the port rather than the mausoleum itself. The loss was real and significant. The destruction of the library as a functioning institution, it was not. But the story settled into the tradition and has stayed there, which says something about how readily the ancient world understood a fire in Alexandria as a civilizational wound. Caesar held his perimeter through the winter of 48 into 47 BCE. The fighting was urban and grinding, street by street in some areas, building by building in the waterfront district. Caesar, in his own account of the war, describes the tactical problems with characteristic clarity and characteristic self-satisfaction, the narrow streets that prevented Roman formations from operating at full effectiveness, the rooftop positions from which the Alexandrians rained projectiles, the constant pressure on the harbor line. He describes his own men as performing well. He does not describe himself as having been in any serious danger, which is almost certainly not accurate. The alliance between Arsinoe and Achilles collapsed within weeks of its formation. The sources are not entirely clear on what precipitated the break, whether it was a specific dispute over command authority or a disagreement about strategy, or simply the incompatibility of two people who had aligned out of convenience rather than trust. What is clear is the outcome. Arsinoe had Achilles killed and replaced him with a eunuch from her own household named Ganymede. He proved to be a more capable military commander than his predecessor, and who introduced a genuinely clever tactic: contaminating Alexandria's freshwater supply by pumping seawater into the underground cisterns that the city depended on. The psychological effect on Caesar's troops was considerable. The physical effect was manageable. Caesar set his men to digging new wells within the palace precinct, and fresh water was found. But the episode demonstrated that the opposition had imagination as well as numbers, and that the war was going to be longer and more difficult than the early weeks had suggested. Ptolemy XIII remained in the palace through most of this period, the most peculiar figure in an already peculiar situation. A 13-year-old king nominally at the center of a war being fought in his name, surrounded by the Roman general who had effectively made him a captive. With his eldest sister on one side of the palace walls and his younger sister commanding armies on the other. At some point in the early months of 47 BCE, he asked Caesar to release him, to let him go to his army and his people, to be a free king rather than a diplomatic hostage. Caesar, in what Plutarch presents as either a magnanimous gesture or a calculated move to remove a complication, let him go. Ptolemy XIII rejoined the Egyptian forces. He did not survive long. In the final engagement of the Alexandrian War, fought near the Nile Delta in the spring of 47 BCE, after the arrival of Roman reinforcements under a general named Mithridates of Pergamon, the Egyptian forces were routed. Ptolemy XIII attempted to flee by boat across the Nile. The boat, overloaded with men trying to escape, capsized or swamped. He drowned. His body was later recovered, identified by the golden armor he had been wearing. He was approximately 14 years old. His death ended the war. Caesar had won, not brilliantly, not with the sweep of his Gallic campaigns, but sufficiently. Alexandria submitted. Arsinoe IV surrendered and was taken captive. Cleopatra was confirmed as ruler of Egypt, nominally in co-regency with the youngest and last of the Ptolemaic brothers, another child named Ptolemy XIV, who was perhaps 11 and who represented no political threat to anyone. The confirmation of Cleopatra's authority was not merely a political settlement. It was, by this point, also a personal one. Sometime during the months of the Alexandrian War, the precise timing is debated, but probably in the late winter or early spring of 47 BCE, Cleopatra became pregnant. The child, born in June of 47 BCE, was given the name Ptolemy Caesar. He would be known informally in Alexandria and eventually in Rome as Caesarion, Little Caesar. Whether Caesar was in fact the father is one of those questions that ancient sources debate and modern historians cannot definitively resolve. Caesar himself never formally acknowledged the child as his own. To do so would have been constitutionally complicated in Rome, where the legal recognition of foreign-born children as Roman citizens and heirs was not straightforward. Cleopatra consistently maintained that Caesarion was Caesar's son, and most ancient sources accept this without extended argument. Octavian would later find it politically necessary to deny it, which is its own kind of evidence. What is not debated is what happened after the war ended. Caesar and Cleopatra spent several weeks traveling together up the Nile, a journey in a flotilla of royal barges that moved southward from Alexandria through the Delta and into the long valley of Upper Egypt, past the great temples and the ancient monuments of the pharaonic world. Caesar brought 2 legions with him. The journey was not, in its primary character, a pleasure cruise. It was a progress, a royal demonstration conducted along the entire navigable length of the kingdom of Cleopatra's restored authority. The Egyptian population along the Nile saw their queen traveling in state, accompanied by a Roman general whose military power was not in question. The temples received visits. The priestly establishments were confirmed in their positions. The nome administrators were reminded that there was a functioning central authority in Alexandria again, that the civil conflict was over, and that the queen who had identified herself with Isis and spoken to them in their own language was back on the throne, with the most powerful man in the Roman world at her side. As a piece of political communication, it was exceptionally well designed. Then Caesar left. He had a war to finish. Pompey's remaining supporters were still active in North Africa, and the business of his dictatorship in Rome was accumulating in his absence. He sailed in the summer of 47 BCE. He left 3 legions behind in Egypt to support Cleopatra's position, which was a significant military guarantee and also a significant constraint. Roman troops on Egyptian soil were protection and presence simultaneously, and their loyalty was ultimately to Rome rather than to her. Cleopatra was 22. She was the confirmed ruler of Egypt. She was the mother of a child whose father was the dictator of Rome. Arsinoe IV was a Roman captive, which meant she was alive and would eventually need to be dealt with. And Rome, where the civil war was still not fully concluded, was the place where Egypt's future would ultimately be determined. She needed to be there. And so, in 46 BCE, Cleopatra sailed for Rome, walking directly into the city that had been slowly consuming her dynasty for 3 generations, to sit across from the man whose protection her kingdom depended on, in a city where everything about her presence was politically explosive. What she found there, and what Caesar's Rome was becoming in those final months before the Ides of March, would make the stakes of her situation clearer than anything that had come before. Chapter 7: Rome at a Distance. Rome in 46 BCE was a city in the process of being remade by one man's will. That man was running out of patience with the forms that constrained him. Caesar had returned from his North African campaign in the summer of 46 BCE. He arrived having defeated the last organized military resistance to his rule. Cato, the most principled and most inflexible of his republican opponents, had killed himself at Utica rather than accept Caesar's pardon. This was a death that immediately became a political symbol. It was the kind that outlasts the man who dies and complicates the position of the man who survives it. Caesar was dictator, effectively unchallenged. He was governing a republic whose institutions still technically existed and whose senators still technically met and voted. But their decisions now moved through channels that Caesar controlled. The Senate was large, compliant, and increasingly ceremonial. The real decisions happened elsewhere. Into this city came Cleopatra with Caesarion and a substantial retinue sometime in the late months of 46 BCE. Caesar had arranged accommodation for her across the Tiber. She stayed in the gardens and villa complex that he maintained on the right bank. This was outside the formal boundary of the city, which was both practically convenient and politically significant. A foreign queen residing inside Rome proper would have created a different set of problems than a foreign queen residing in Caesar's private gardens across the river. The distinction was thin enough to be largely symbolic, but Roman political culture ran on symbolic distinctions. Caesar, who understood this better than almost anyone, had made the arrangement accordingly. She stayed for roughly 18 months. What those 18 months actually consisted of is recoverable only in fragments. The texture of her daily life in Rome, her movements, her conversations, and the people she met, most of these accounts are hostile. Roman aristocratic society was not welcoming. A foreign queen of ambiguous status, residing in the private accommodations of the dictator, was an affront to several overlapping Roman sensibilities simultaneously. These involved the proper relationship between Rome and its client states and the proper behavior of a Roman man in his private life. There was also the question of the proper distance between Roman political culture and the Eastern Mediterranean world it was absorbing. These sensibilities were not entirely principled. Many of the men who expressed outrage at Cleopatra's presence in Rome had no objection to Eastern luxury when it arrived in forms that benefited them personally, but they were genuinely felt, or felt genuinely enough to be expressed in letters that survived. The most direct surviving account of a Roman's personal encounter with Cleopatra comes from Cicero. In a letter to his friend Atticus written probably in 44 BCE, he reflects on his experience. Cicero was the greatest orator of the late Republic, a man of genuine intellectual distinction and considerable personal vanity. His letter is brief, cutting, and almost entirely about himself. He had visited Caesar's gardens across the Tiber, the reasons are not specified, and had encountered Cleopatra there. His account focuses on a promise she had apparently made to provide him with certain books or scholarly materials from the Alexandrian collections. This was a promise that had not been kept in the manner he expected. He describes her behavior as arrogant. He says the recollection of it is painful to him. He offers no description of her appearance, no assessment of her intelligence, and no political analysis of her position. What offended Cicero was that she had not been sufficiently deferential to Cicero. The letter is one of the more unintentionally revealing documents of the period. A man of Cicero's perceptiveness, encountering one of the most politically significant figures of the age, produces a complaint about a delayed book delivery. It suggests that Cleopatra's manner in Rome was not accommodating. She did not perform the grateful deference that Roman aristocrats expected from client rulers and foreign visitors. This made her unpopular in circles that might otherwise have been more neutral about her presence. Caesar, for his part, made his own statement about Cleopatra's status in Rome in a form that was considerably more durable than a letter to a friend. In 46 BCE, he dedicated the temple of Venus Genetrix. This was Venus as the ancestral mother of the Julian family, the goddess from whom Caesar claimed descent. It was part of his new Forum Julium, a building project that was reshaping the center of Rome. Inside the temple, he placed a gilded statue of Cleopatra. The audacity of this requires a moment of attention. This was not a private gesture or a subtle diplomatic signal. This was a golden statue of a living foreign queen placed inside a Roman sacred space dedicated to the divine ancestor of Caesar's own family. It was in the most publicly visible new building in the city. It collapsed several distinctions simultaneously between Roman and foreign, between divine and human, between Caesar's public religious life and his private political alliances. Romans who visited the temple of Venus Genetrix to make offerings to their ancestral goddess found themselves standing in front of a monument to the Queen of Egypt. The reactions were not universally negative. Caesar had supporters who understood the statement he was making, that the Egyptian alliance was central to his political and potentially his dynastic ambitions. They saw that Cleopatra was not a private matter to be kept across the river, but a political relationship to be acknowledged in stone and gold. But among the men who were already uneasy about the direction of Caesar's rule, the statue was another piece of evidence for a case they were already building. These were the men who believed that the Republic's forms were not merely ceremonial, but essential. They felt that one man's accumulation of power was a disease that would kill the Roman political tradition. The divine honors question was the sharpest edge of this tension. In the Eastern Mediterranean world, rulers being identified with gods or receiving divine honors was conventional. The Ptolemaic tradition of divine kingship was ancient, and Cleopatra's identification with Isis was simply the current expression of a practice that went back to Alexander. In Rome, the tradition was different. Roman religious culture could accommodate divine honors for the dead. The deification of deceased rulers would become standard under the empire. But divine honors for the living were another matter entirely. This was a step toward the kind of monarchy that Romans had expelled the Tarquins for attempting and swore they would never permit again. Caesar was receiving divine honors. Statues of him were being placed in temples alongside the gods. A priest was appointed specifically for his cult. The month of July was named for him. He was accumulating the forms of divine kingship in ways that the Roman political tradition could not easily accommodate. The men watching this accumulation were drawing conclusions. Whether Cleopatra encouraged these developments or simply benefited from a trajectory that was already in motion before she arrived is a question the sources do not settle. What is clear is that her presence in Rome coincided with the period of maximum tension between Caesar's ambitions and the Republican tradition's capacity to absorb them. She was therefore present in the city when everything broke. The Ides of March fell on the 15th of March, 44 BCE. Caesar was killed in the theater of Pompeii. The irony of the location was not lost on ancient observers. He was surrounded by a group of senators numbering somewhere between 20 and 60, depending on which account you follow. They stabbed him 23 times. The specific grievances of the conspirators varied. Some were genuine Republicans, Some were personal enemies. Some were men who had accepted Caesar's pardons and resented that they owed their lives to his generosity. Brutus and Cassius, who led the conspiracy, had both been pardoned by Caesar after Pharsalus. They killed him anyway. Cleopatra was across the Tiber when it happened. She learned of it by messenger, by the sudden change in the city's atmosphere, by whatever network of information a foreign queen maintaining her position in a hostile city would have developed over 18 months. The structure on which her entire position in Rome rested had just been destroyed in a few minutes in a Roman theater. She did not wait to see how the aftermath developed. Within weeks, she was gone, back to Alexandria with Caesarion, with the retinue, and with whatever she had accumulated. She left with whatever conclusions she had drawn from 18 months of watching the most powerful city in the world from a villa across its river. She had seen Rome from the inside. She had watched Caesar build and be destroyed. She had been present for the final act of the Roman Republic's long unraveling. She understood, with the clarity that comes from having observed something without being fully embedded in it, what the men left behind were going to do to each other. Rome was going to have another civil war, possibly several. The men who had killed Caesar, Brutus, Cassius, the conspirators, and the men who had been Caesar's supporters, Antony, Octavian, Lepidus, were already positioning themselves. They were already calculating, moving toward the confrontation that would determine who governed the Roman world next. And whoever won that confrontation was going to need Egypt, its grain, its treasury, its strategic position in the eastern Mediterranean. They were going to need what Cleopatra had. The question was which of them she would choose, and whether the choice would be hers to make or theirs to demand. She had 4 years to prepare before the answer arrived, and she used them. What she built in those 4 years, the alliances she cultivated, the resources she assembled, the political position she constructed in anticipation of Rome's next move, meant that when a Roman general finally came looking for Egypt's support, he would not find a kingdom waiting passively for instructions. He would find a queen who had already decided what she wanted from him, and she had thought considerably more carefully about the terms than he had. Chapter 8. The Barge on the Cydnus. The 4 years between Caesar's assassination and the meeting at Tarsus were not quiet ones for Cleopatra, even though the sources treat them as a gap. They see a pause in the narrative between one Roman alliance and the next, as if Egypt simply waited in the wings while the important events happened elsewhere. Egypt did not wait. Cleopatra did not wait. She returned to Alexandria in the spring of 44 BCE and immediately confronted a domestic problem she had left unresolved. Ptolemy XIV, the child brother who had been her nominal co-ruler since the end of the Alexandrian War, was still alive. He still technically held a title that any court faction ambitious enough could use as a vehicle for opposition. The sources are brief and somewhat evasive on what happened next. Ptolemy XIV died in 44 BCE, shortly after Cleopatra's return, of causes the ancient writers describe with vagueness. This is the vagueness that ancient writers typically deploy when the causes were probably not natural. He was perhaps 12 years old. Cleopatra replaced him as co-ruler with Caesarion, who was 3, formalizing the dynastic claim she intended to press. Her son was Caesar's heir. The Ptolemaic line continued through him, and Egypt's future was bound to whoever in Rome would eventually acknowledge that claim. This was not a sentimental decision. It was a calculated one. Caesarion's status as Caesar's son, contested in Rome but asserted consistently in Alexandria, gave Cleopatra a piece on the Roman political board that no other Eastern ruler possessed. If the Caesarian faction won the coming civil war, his parentage was an asset of enormous value. If it lost, it was a liability of equal magnitude. She understood both sides of this and proceeded anyway, which tells you something about her assessment of the odds. In Rome, the civil war she had anticipated was unfolding on schedule. The conspirators and Caesar's supporters had moved from uneasy coexistence to open conflict with considerable speed. By 42 BCE, Brutus and Cassius had been defeated and killed at the Battle of Philippi in northern Greece. These were 2 engagements fought within weeks of each other. The second left Octavian and Antony in possession of the Roman world, and Cassius and Brutus in possession of nothing at all, including their lives. The second triumvirate, Octavian, Antony, and the third partner, Lepidus, who was already being marginalized, had formally divided the Roman world between them. Octavian took the west. Antony took the east. The east meant everything from Greece to the Persian frontier. It was the richest, most urbanized, most commercially active portion of the Roman sphere. It meant the kingdoms that paid tribute to Rome and the trade routes that moved goods from India and Arabia into the Mediterranean. It meant the military frontier with Parthia that had been a source of Roman anxiety since Crassus had lost his army there in 53 BCE. Antony's eastern command was not a consolation prize. It was, in many respects, the more immediately valuable half of the division. It also meant Egypt. Antony moved through the eastern kingdoms in 42 and 41 BCE, receiving delegations and settling disputes. He extracted money to fund his campaigns and his political position, and generally conducted the business of Roman suzerainty over a large and complicated region. He was efficient and affable in the way that made him popular with soldiers. He was effective at the informal diplomacy of client-king management. He also sent a summons to Cleopatra. The summons was framed as a demand for explanation. During the civil war between the triumvirate and the conspirators, Egypt had provided assistance to Cassius, or had been accused of providing assistance, which in the political climate of 41 BCE amounted to approximately the same thing. Cleopatra had in fact sent 4 legions of Roman troops that Caesar had left in Egypt toward the triumvirate's forces, but they had been intercepted and co-opted by Cassius's forces before they arrived. Whether this was Cleopatra's intention or an outcome she had been unable to prevent was precisely the kind of question that required personal clarification. Antony's summons called her to Tarsus, a city in Cilicia on the southern coast of what is now Turkey. He had established his headquarters there for the Eastern administration. The tone of the summons, as the sources render it, was not friendly. It was the tone a Roman general uses when calling a subordinate client ruler to account. Cleopatra ignored the first summons, and the second. This was not inattention. It was calibration. Each refusal allowed her to observe how Antony responded, whether he escalated, whether he sent stronger language, or whether he dispatched a representative to press the demand. He sent Quintus Dellius, one of his staff officers, to Alexandria to reiterate the request in person. Dellius, by Plutarch's account, arrived expecting the court of a client ruler and found something considerably more impressive. He returned to Antony with a report that amounted to, "You should be careful how you approach this woman." Cleopatra finally agreed to come to Tarsus, but the manner of her coming was entirely her own design. Plutarch's account of her arrival on the Cydnus River is one of the most detailed descriptive passages in his lives. It is worth treating seriously as a record of a real event rather than literary embellishment. The specific details he preserves have the texture of eyewitness report filtered through several decades of retelling. She came by river barge. The barge had a gilded stern and purple sails, purple being the color of royalty across the ancient Mediterranean, a dye so expensive that its use was itself a statement of resources. The oars were silver, and they moved in time to flutes and pipes playing on deck. The deck was covered with awnings of gold cloth. Under the awnings, attendants dressed as sea nymphs stood at the ropes and the tillers. Incense burned in quantities large enough that the smell of it reached the shore before the barge itself came into view, so that people standing on the riverbank knew, before they could see anything, that something extraordinary was approaching. Cleopatra reclined under a canopy at the center of it all, dressed as Aphrodite. She was the Greek goddess of love and beauty, the counterpart to the Roman Venus. Her identification with Isis was well established in the syncretic religious culture of the Eastern Mediterranean. Boys dressed as cupids stood on either side of her, fanning her. The effect, by the time the barge reached the city, was that the Queen of Egypt had arrived as a goddess made visible. She moved up a river in a vehicle that was itself a piece of theatrical design of the highest order. The city of Tarsus, by Plutarch's account, emptied. The population moved to the riverbanks to watch. The marketplace where Antony sat on his official tribunal gradually drained of people. He sat there essentially alone, with a thin scatter of attendants, while the entire city stood on the waterfront watching the barge come in. Plutarch records this detail with the observation that a rumor ran through the crowd that Aphrodite had come to revel with Dionysus for the good of Asia. Antony had a long-standing personal identification with Dionysus, the god of wine, festivity, and divine excess. He cultivated this deliberately as part of his public persona in the East. The rumor was not spontaneous. It had been designed. The identification of Cleopatra as Aphrodite meeting Antony as Dionysus was a piece of religious political theater. It framed the encounter as a divine meeting of equals, the goddess of the East arriving to treat with the god of Rome's Eastern power on terms of parity. She sent an invitation to dinner. Antony accepted and offered to host her instead. She declined and counter-offered again, and he came to her barge. What he found on the barge is one of those passages where ancient sources reach for superlatives. The dinner, by Plutarch's account, was of extraordinary elaborateness. The lighting arrangements alone, involving thousands of lamps arranged in geometric patterns, were remarked upon by the witnesses. The food, the service, and the organization of the evening were at a level of sophistication that demonstrated the scale of resources that Cleopatra commanded. Antony, who had a genuine appreciation for physical pleasure and festive excess, was not immune to this. He stayed in Tarsus longer than his schedule required. Then he went with her to Alexandria for the winter. The winter of 41 to 40 BCE in Alexandria is another of those periods where the sources give you atmosphere and anecdote rather than political substance. They founded a famous society which they called the Inimitable Livers, dedicated to elaborate dining and entertainment. Plutarch records pranks and wagers and diversions with evident enjoyment. The picture that emerges from these anecdotes is of two people who genuinely liked each other's company. This is worth noting because the ancient sources so consistently frame the relationship in terms of Antony's weakness and Cleopatra's manipulation. The simpler possibility that they found each other interesting tends to get lost, but the winter had substance beneath its entertainment. Cleopatra was not simply hosting a Roman general she found attractive. She was building an alliance with the most powerful military figure in the Eastern Mediterranean on terms that gave Egypt leverage rather than simply dependency. The resources she was demonstrating were the same resources that had given her father leverage in Rome. She was deploying them from a position of confirmed authority rather than anxious petition. Antony needed what she had. His Parthian campaign, the military project that would define his Eastern command, required funding, supply lines, and a secure base of operations. Egypt provided all three. The alliance was not charity. It was a transaction, and she was negotiating it from a position of genuine strength. By the time Antony left Alexandria in the spring of 40 BCE, Cleopatra was pregnant with twins. He did not know this when he sailed. He was leaving because he had to. His relationship with Octavian, always fragile, had fractured into open hostility during his absence. His wife Fulvia had actually gone to war against Octavian in Italy on his behalf. That campaign had ended badly and required his personal presence to manage the diplomatic fallout. He sailed west. Fulvia died, conveniently, from an illness before she could become a more complicated political problem, and Octavian, who needed Antony's military cooperation, offered a solution to the breach between them. The solution was his sister. Octavia was, by all accounts, a woman of intelligence, dignity, and considerable personal quality. She was also Octavian's instrument, a piece in his political game. The offer of her hand in marriage to Antony was framed as a gesture of reconciliation between the two triumvirs. Antony accepted. He married Octavia in 40 BCE and settled into a period of Roman domestic life that was unusually conventional. In Alexandria, Cleopatra gave birth to twins. She named them Alexander Helios and Cleopatra Selene, the sun and the moon. She raised them in the royal palace, administered Egypt, managed the kingdom's finances, and waited. She understood that Antony's marriage to Octavia was not a termination of what had been established in Alexandria. It was a pause. The forces that had brought him there had not changed. His need for Egyptian resources, his Eastern ambitions, and his temperamental incompatibility with the cold precision of Octavian's political style remained. They had simply been temporarily suspended by the pressure of Roman domestic politics. He would come back. The only question was what condition he would be in when he did, and what would have happened in the years between that would determine the terms on which he returned. What did happen in those years was a military disaster that changed the balance of the alliance in ways neither of them had fully anticipated. It made Cleopatra's resources not merely useful to Antony, but essential to his political survival. Chapter 9: The city he kept coming back to. The Parthian campaign was supposed to be the making of Mark Antony. He had planned it for years, a military operation against the Parthian Empire that would accomplish what no Roman general had managed since Crassus had lost his army and his life at Carrhae in 53 BCE. Carrhae was a wound in the Roman military imagination that had not healed. 3 legions destroyed, their eagles captured, the standards of Rome displayed as trophies in a foreign capital. Whoever avenged Carrhae, whoever crossed into Parthian territory, recovered the eagles and demonstrated that Roman power extended to the eastern frontier, would stand in a position of military prestige that no rival could easily challenge. Caesar had been planning a Parthian campaign when the conspirators killed him. Antony, as inheritor of Caesar's eastern command and Caesar's soldiers, considered it his natural continuation of that unfinished business. He launched it in 36 BCE, moving east from Armenia with a force of somewhere between 60 and 100,000 men, the largest Roman army assembled in a generation. The plan required speed. He intended to strike deep into Parthian territory before the enemy could concentrate their forces, capture the Parthian capital, and return with the eagles and a victory that would reshape the political landscape of the Roman world. The plan failed in its first weeks. Antony had sent his siege train, the heavy equipment, the artillery, the battering rams and siege towers that would be required to reduce fortified Parthian cities, ahead on a separate route under the command of a subordinate officer. The Parthians found it. They destroyed it entirely. Antony continued into Parthian territory without his siege equipment, because turning back immediately would have been a political and military humiliation he could not afford. He felt the campaign's logic was committed, the army was in motion, the investment had been made, and the hope of recovering the situation with speed and improvisation was more appealing than the certain damage of immediate retreat. It was not recovered. The Parthians, who had learned from Carrhae how to fight Romans in their own territory, avoiding pitched engagement, using their cavalry archers to harass rather than confront, stretching Roman supply lines to the point of collapse, executed the same strategy against Antony's force that they had executed against Crassus. They did not defeat him in a single catastrophic engagement. They simply made it impossible for him to advance, made the supply situation progressively worse, and waited for the combination of hunger, distance, and Armenian unreliability to do their work. The retreat from Parthia lasted 27 days and covered roughly 300 miles through difficult terrain in deteriorating weather. Antony's army was harassed continuously by Parthian cavalry. Disease moved through the ranks. Food ran short. By the time the army reached safety, it had lost somewhere between a quarter and a third of its strength, 20 to 30,000 men dead by various ancient estimates from combat, starvation, and exposure. The eagles were not recovered. The Parthian capital was not taken. The campaign that was supposed to be the making of Antony's career had become, instead, the thing his enemies would use against him for the rest of his life. He needed money. He needed ships. He needed grain to refit and rebuild a damaged army. He needed the material resources to conduct a second campaign that might recover something from the wreckage of the first, and he needed them from a source that could provide them without the political conditions that Octavian would attach to any assistance from the West. He went to Alexandria. Cleopatra met him at the Syrian coast, not in Alexandria, but on the coast, with ships loaded with supplies, clothing, and money. The gesture was deliberate. She was not waiting in her palace for a Roman general to come and collect what she owed him. She was meeting him where he was, with what he needed, before he asked. This was the dynamic she had been building since Tarsus, not a client providing resources under Roman direction, but an ally whose support was offered from a position of independent judgment about where her interests lay. Antony's marriage to Octavia had not been dissolved. It was simply no longer the operational center of his political life. He had spent limited time with Octavia since the marriage, a period in Athens in 39 and 38 BCE, during which she had accompanied him and, by all accounts, served him loyally and well. But Octavia was Octavian's sister, which meant that every kindness Antony showed her was also in the political calculus of the triumvirate, a gesture toward Octavian. It was an acknowledgement that the reconciliation of 40 BCE still held, that Antony's eastern operation was still conducted within the framework of triumviral cooperation rather than in opposition to it. The relationship had become, in other words, a political constraint as much as a personal one. Cleopatra was not a constraint. She was a resource, and she understood that the most effective way to secure Egypt's position was to make herself indispensable to the man who controlled the eastern Mediterranean. This required that she remain the primary source of the support he could not get elsewhere. She funded the rebuilding of his army. She provided the ships he needed for a second Armenian campaign in 34 BCE, a more limited operation than the Parthian disaster. This was directed at the Armenian king who had abandoned Antony during the retreat, which succeeded in capturing him and recovering a measure of military credibility. And she was present, increasingly, as a political partner rather than merely a financial one, attending his military councils, participating in the strategic discussions, being consulted rather than simply informed. Then came the donations of Alexandria. In the autumn of 34 BCE, following the return from Armenia, Antony staged a ceremony in Alexandria that was designed to communicate something about the political order he was constructing in the East. The setting was the Gymnasium, one of Alexandria's great public spaces, a building associated with Greek civic culture and education. A silver platform had been erected inside it. On the platform stood 2 golden thrones. Antony and Cleopatra sat on those thrones before an audience that included the Alexandrian public, the court, and representatives of the eastern kingdoms that fell within Antony's sphere. From those thrones, Antony made a series of proclamations. Cleopatra was declared Queen of Kings and Queen of Egypt, Cyprus, Libya, and the Middle East, a title and a territorial claim that formalized her authority over a domain considerably larger than Egypt proper. Caesarion, now 13, was formally acknowledged as the legitimate son of Julius Caesar and co-ruler with his mother. This was a direct challenge to Octavian's position as Caesar's primary heir, since if Caesarion was legitimate, then Octavian's claim to be Caesar's son by adoption was superseded by Caesar's biological child. The three children of Antony and Cleopatra received kingdoms of their own. Alexander Helios was given Armenia, Media, and Parthia, Parthia being a territory Antony had notably failed to conquer, which gave the grant a quality of aspiration rather than description. Cleopatra Selene received Cyrenaica and Libya. Ptolemy Philadelphus, the youngest, born in 36 BCE, received Syria and Cilicia. Antony and Cleopatra sat on golden thrones on a silver platform in the Gymnasium of Alexandria and distributed the Eastern Mediterranean to their children. The ceremony had the quality of a new world being declared into existence, a Ptolemaic Roman order centered on Alexandria rather than Rome, with Antony as its military guarantor and Cleopatra as its sovereign center. Rome received this information through Octavian. Octavian had been watching Antony's eastern operation with the careful attention of a man who understood that everything happening there had implications for the balance of power in Rome. He had been engaged in his own military operations in the West, the campaigns against Sextus Pompey that had secured Roman control of Sicily, and the Illyrian campaigns that had given him military credibility he had previously lacked. He had also been building his political position in Rome with a consistency and methodical intelligence that Antony, operating at the far end of the Mediterranean, had not been sufficiently attending to. Octavian's response to the donations was not immediate military action. It was a propaganda campaign of sustained brilliance. He did not present the donations as a political dispute between two Roman triumvirs, a framing that would have made it look like another civil war, which Romans were exhausted by. He presented them as evidence that Antony had been captured by the East, by its luxury, by its foreign queen, by the corrupting influence of a woman who had subordinated a Roman general's judgment to her own ambitions. The donations were not a political settlement in Octavian's framing. They were an act of betrayal, a Roman man giving Roman-conquered territory to a foreign queen and her illegitimate children. He painted a picture of a man abandoning his Roman wife for an Egyptian sorceress, planning to move the capital of the Roman world from Rome to Alexandria. The Roman wife was the crucial element. Octavia had been waiting in Rome, maintaining Antony's household, raising his children alongside her own. She was a figure of public dignity whose treatment by Antony had become, in Octavian's presentation, a symbol of how the East corrupted Roman men. When Antony formally divorced her in 32 BCE, he handed Octavian the single most effective piece of propaganda in the entire conflict. Octavia had done nothing wrong. She had been a good wife by every standard Roman culture recognized. Her brother made sure Rome knew it. The divorce triggered a cascade of political events that moved faster than Antony appeared to anticipate. Prominent Romans who had been sitting in Antony's camp, including both consuls of 32 BCE, quietly crossed to Octavian's side. Octavian escalated his attacks in public speeches and in the network of poets and writers whose work shaped Roman public opinion. Antony responded with counter-accusations, letters read out in the Senate, documents circulated through his supporters, but he was responding, which meant Octavian was setting the terms of the argument. Then Octavian did something constitutionally irregular and politically devastating. Antony's will was held by the Vestal Virgins, the priestesses whose temple served as the deposit for important Roman legal documents, a safeguard considered inviolable by tradition. Octavian went to the Vestals and demanded the will. Whether he persuaded them, pressured them, or simply took it is not clearly recorded. He got it. He read it publicly before the Senate. The will's contents, as Octavian presented them, included a provision requesting that Antony be buried beside Cleopatra in Alexandria. Not in Rome, not in the soil of the city whose traditions he had served as consul and general, but in Egypt, beside a foreign queen. Whether this is what the will actually said, or whether Octavian's reading was selective or embellished, is a question the surviving sources cannot resolve because the will itself did not survive Octavian's political use of it. What survived was the version he presented, and the version he presented was sufficient. The Senate stripped Antony of his future consulship and his command. Then Octavian declared war, not on Antony, but on Cleopatra. This distinction was the most elegant move in the entire sequence. War on Antony was civil war, Romans killing Romans, the thing the generation of Pharsalus and Philippi had sworn they were finished with. War on Cleopatra was foreign war, Rome defending itself against an Eastern queen whose influence had corrupted a Roman general and whose ambitions threatened Roman sovereignty. The same conflict, reframed as a matter of national defense rather than political rivalry. Antony and Cleopatra had been expecting a confrontation and had been preparing for it. Their combined forces were substantial, a fleet of several hundred warships, an army of considerable size, the resources of Egypt's treasury behind them. They moved their base of operations to Greece, to the Bay of Actium on the western coast. There they could position themselves to contest any westward advance by Octavian's forces. What happened at Actium, and what it revealed about the limits of everything Cleopatra had built, was about to become the most debated military engagement of the ancient world. Chapter 10: The Republic Decides. The Bay of Actium is a study in geography as destiny. It sits on the northwestern coast of Greece, where the Ambracian Gulf opens into the Ionian Sea through a narrow channel, perhaps half a mile wide. The Gulf itself is large, deep enough to shelter a fleet of several hundred ships, protected on three sides by land, with that single exit channel as the only way in or out. When Antony and Cleopatra established their combined forces there in the winter of 32 to 31 BCE, the position looked defensible. A large fleet inside a sheltered gulf, with an army encamped on the surrounding land, controlling the channel entrance. It was the kind of position that, on a map, suggested strength. On the ground, it became a trap. Marcus Agrippa arrived first. He was Octavian's admiral and, in the judgment of most military historians, ancient and modern, the most capable naval commander of his generation. He was a man of low birth and extraordinary talent, who had risen through Octavian's patronage to become the operational genius behind everything the Western side accomplished militarily. While Octavian managed the politics, Agrippa managed the war, and he understood immediately what the Actium position meant and how to exploit it. He did not attack the channel. He did not attempt a frontal assault on a fleet that outnumbered his in raw ship count. Instead, he moved methodically along the western Greek coast, capturing the supply ports that fed Antony's position. Leucas fell, Patrae fell, Corinth fell. Each captured port was another point where supply ships could not deliver grain, wine, timber, and the endless material requirements of a large combined force sitting in a bay through a Greek winter. The winter was its own opponent. Disease moved through the encampment on the southern shore of the Gulf with the efficiency that ancient armies in fixed positions always experienced. This was the combination of contaminated water, inadequate sanitation, insufficient nutrition, and the particular vulnerability of men drawn from Egypt and the eastern Mediterranean to the cold damp of a Greek winter. Antony's army was losing men not to battle, but to dysentery and fever, at a rate the sources describe as alarming. The fleet was not immune. Rowers fell sick. Replacements were harder to find as the months passed, and the ships that had looked formidable in the autumn of 32 BCE were crewed by progressively weaker men by the summer of 31. Desertion compounded everything. As Agrippa's supply interdiction tightened and the conditions in the camp deteriorated, officers and men began crossing to Octavian's side in numbers that went beyond individual defection and began to look like a trend. Among those who left were men of significant rank. Domitius Ahenobarbus, one of Antony's most senior commanders, crossed over in the weeks before the battle. Antony, by Plutarch's account, sent Domitius's baggage and servants after him, a gesture of personal dignity that the sources record with evident admiration, and that did nothing to change the military situation. Cleopatra was present at Actium throughout. This was not conventional. Roman commanders' consorts, wives, and political allies did not typically accompany armies on campaign in the field. The proper place for such figures was at a safe remove from the operational theater. Her presence was a point of ongoing tension within Antony's command staff. Plutarch preserves an account of objections raised by a general named Cneidius Crassus, who argued that having the Queen of Egypt in the camp was damaging morale and giving Octavian's propaganda its most effective target. Cleopatra, by Plutarch's account, argued for her own presence with sufficient force that Antony did not remove her. Her reasons were not merely personal. She had funded significant portions of the campaign. Her treasury was the operational resource that kept the enterprise going. Her navy, Egyptian ships crewed by Egyptian sailors, formed a substantial component of the combined fleet. She was not a passenger in someone else's military campaign. She was a co-investor who had brought more to the table than her partner was publicly acknowledging. She was not willing to be managed at a distance. from decisions that determined the fate of her kingdom. The question of what to do, stay in the bay and fight a defensive action, or attempt a breakout, was debated through the summer of 31 BCE as conditions inside the camp continued to deteriorate. A land battle was considered and rejected. Antony's army, weakened by disease and desertion, was not in condition to meet Octavian's forces. These forces had been maintained in better supply and better health through the winter. A naval breakout was the option that remained. It was an attempt to force the channel, engage Agrippa's fleet, and either win decisively or escape with enough ships and men to continue the fight from a different position. The plan that emerged, as best the sources allow reconstruction, was not primarily a plan to win the battle. It was a plan to survive it. The fleet would form up, force the channel, and this is the element that the ancient sources emphasize and that has been debated ever since. The sails were loaded aboard the warships. Ancient warships did not carry their sails into battle. Sails were left on shore. Combat vessels used oars, and the sails were encumbrances that slowed maneuvering and created fire hazards. The presence of sails on the ships at Actium has always indicated, to historians reading the evidence, that the battle plan included a provision for escape under sail after the channel was forced. Whatever happened in the fighting, certain ships were meant to get through and run. Cleopatra's squadron of 60 Egyptian ships carried their sails. On the 2nd of September, 31 BCE, the fleet moved out of the channel. The battle that followed lasted several hours. Antony's northern wing pressed the engagement. Agrippa's fleet, with the tactical flexibility that characterized his operations, refused to be drawn into close quarters fighting. He avoided spots where individual ship strength mattered and instead used superior maneuverability to maintain distance and avoid being boarded. The fighting was real. Ships burned. Men died. The engagement was not a theatrical performance, but it did not produce the decisive Roman collapse that would have allowed the plan to succeed cleanly. Then Cleopatra's squadron moved. In the early afternoon, with the battle unresolved and the wind shifting to come from the north, Cleopatra's 60 ships broke through the fighting line, raised their sails, and ran south. They had the wind. They moved fast. Within hours, they were clear of the engagement and heading for Egypt. Antony followed. This is the moment that ancient sources, almost without exception, treat as the turning point, not just of the battle, but of the entire story. Antony, seeing Cleopatra's squadron break free, transferred to a smaller vessel, crossed the battle line, and pursued her. He caught up with her flagship, boarded it, and sat alone at the prow for 3 days, speaking to no one, by Plutarch's account. He was a figure of theatrical collapse, a great man undone by a woman, sitting in silence while his fleet and army continued fighting without him. His fleet surrendered within a week. His army, learning that he had abandoned the field, negotiated its own capitulation to Octavian 7 days after the battle. The largest military force assembled in the eastern Mediterranean in a generation, dissolved without a final engagement. The interpretation of what happened, why Cleopatra's squadron withdrew, whether Antony's pursuit was a decision or a reflex, has occupied historians for 2,000 years without resolution. The ancient sources, almost all of them writing under Octavian's empire, present it as Antony following a woman rather than his duty, overcome by love or infatuation at the crucial moment. This is the reading that served Octavian's narrative, and it is consequently the reading that dominated the tradition. A different reading is available. Cleopatra's fleet was Egypt's navy. It was not expendable. A commander who lost Egypt's naval capacity in a battle she could not win had returned home with no means of defending the kingdom. She was still responsible for governing. The withdrawal was a decision to preserve what could be preserved: the ships. The treasury reportedly carried aboard some of the vessels, the capacity to continue fighting from Egyptian territory. Whether Antony's pursuit was agreed in advance or impulsive, whether the whole sequence was a strategic retreat or an improvisation, these questions cannot be resolved from the surviving evidence. What can be said is that Cleopatra arrived back in Alexandria while the battle's outcome was still uncertain. She entered the harbor with her sails dressed as if for a victory and began immediately managing the consequences. She was doing what she had always done, taking the situation as it was rather than as she had hoped it would be, and deciding what to do next. The treasury was still largely intact. Alexandria still stood. She had children to protect and a kingdom to potentially negotiate. Octavian was not yet in Egypt, and the weeks between the battle's end and his arrival were weeks in which options might still exist. She would look for a way forward if she moved carefully, if she read Octavian correctly, if she found the leverage point in his intentions that every situation, in her experience, contained. She had found it with Caesar. She had found it with Antony. She was about to discover whether she could find it one more time with the coldest and most calculating of the 3 Roman men her reign had produced. What Octavian wanted from her, and what he was willing to let her believe he wanted, would determine everything that happened next. And Octavian, unlike the men who had come before him, had been thinking about this moment for a very long time. Chapter 11: The Long Retreat. Antony arrived in Alexandria a broken man. That is not a psychological diagnosis. It is a description of what the sources record, and the sources, even filtered through 2,000 years of literary elaboration, are consistent on the basic picture. He had abandoned his fleet in the middle of a battle. He had abandoned his army. He had boarded a smaller vessel and chased a woman's squadron across the Ionian Sea, while the men who had followed him from Italy and Syria and Egypt across the better part of a decade fought and surrendered without him. Whatever the operational logic of Cleopatra's withdrawal and whatever the agreement or non-agreement that preceded it, the facts of what he had done were not disputable, and Antony appears to have understood them with full clarity. He did not go directly to the palace when he reached Alexandria. Plutarch records that he went instead to a promontory on the eastern side of the harbor, a place where a small structure was built out over the water, and that he spent several days there alone. He had given the structure a name that carried its own quiet weight. He called it the Timonium, after Timon of Athens, the legendary misanthrope who had withdrawn from human society in disgust and contempt. The name was not accidental. It was a man announcing, through architecture and classical reference, what he thought of his situation and himself. Cleopatra did not wait on the promontory with him. She had a kingdom to manage. The weeks immediately following Actium were among the most operationally intense of her reign. She needed to accomplish several things simultaneously, and the window for accomplishing any of them was closing as Octavian's forces consolidated their control of Greece and began moving east. She moved the treasury, or a substantial portion of it, into the mausoleum she had been constructing near the Temple of Isis on the palace precinct's edge. The mausoleum was not yet complete, but it was far enough along to serve as a secured repository, and she began filling it with gold, silver, gems, and the other portable components of the Ptolemaic treasury. She also reportedly filled it with quantities of timber and tow, combustible material that could, if necessary, be ignited to destroy the treasury rather than allow it to fall into Octavian's hands. This was leverage. It was the only significant leverage she had left, and she understood its nature precisely. Octavian needed Egypt's resources. He needed the grain supply, the tax revenues, the accumulated wealth of the Ptolemaic treasury to fund the enormous obligations he had accumulated, the veterans of his armies expecting land grants, the political infrastructure of his new order requiring money to build and maintain. An Egypt whose treasury had burned was considerably less useful to him than an Egypt whose treasury was intact. The combustible material in the mausoleum was not a death wish. It was a negotiating position. She also opened diplomatic channels. Envoys went to Octavian carrying proposals whose specific terms the sources do not fully preserve. The outline is visible in the responses, which indicate she was seeking guarantees for her children's futures and possibly for her own continued role in some form. She was not, at this stage, attempting to preserve the Ptolemaic dynasty as an independent power. That possibility had ended at Actium. What she was attempting to preserve was something more limited and more personal, the lives and positions of her children, and particularly the legitimacy of Caesarion, whose status as Caesar's son remained the single most politically explosive element of the entire situation. Octavian's responses were carefully designed to keep her uncertain without committing him to anything. He sent back messages that were warm enough to suggest flexibility and vague enough to guarantee nothing. He was doing what he had always been better at than anyone else in the Roman world, managing information and expectations simultaneously, letting people believe what was useful for them to believe without actually saying the thing that would constitute a promise he might later have to honor. Antony eventually emerged from the Timonium and returned to the palace. Whatever private conversations he and Cleopatra had during these weeks, the sources do not preserve them. What they record is that the old life resumed in a modified form. The inimitable livers, their society of elaborate dining and entertainment, was reconstituted under a new name, the Synapatha Numenoi, which means something approximately like those who will die together. It was a dark joke, in the way that very frightened people sometimes make dark jokes. They gave elaborate dinner parties. They continued living at a scale that the circumstances did not obviously support. This has been read as denial, as decadence, as the behavior of people who have given up. It is perhaps more accurately read as the behavior of people who understood their situation completely and had decided that maintaining the forms of royal life until the end was preferable to the visible collapse that abandoning those forms would represent. Cleopatra was still the Queen of Egypt. Antony was still a Roman general and triumvir, however diminished. The dinners were a form of governance, a signal to the court, the city, and the Eastern kingdoms still watching that the position had not yet conceded. Antony sent his son Antyllus, his eldest son by Fulvia, to Octavian with a large sum of money and a request for terms. The money was accepted. The request was not answered substantively. Octavian was moving efficiently through Greece, across the Aegean, through Asia Minor and Syria, receiving the surrenders of kingdoms and commanders as he went with the calm efficiency of a man who understood that his victory was complete and that the only remaining question was how to administer it. Cleopatra's most significant diplomatic effort in these final months was directed not at securing her own position, but at securing Caesarions. She sent her son, 17 years old by now, formerly the co-ruler of Egypt and the acknowledged son of Julius Caesar, south toward the Red Sea with a large escort, money, and instructions to make for India if necessary. The plan was to get him out of Octavian's reach before Octavian arrived in Alexandria, placing him beyond the geography of the Roman world's immediate grasp. She also sent her other children east toward Syria with another escort. She was distributing the pieces of her dynasty across the map in the hope that Octavian would not be able to collect all of them. Octavian arrived in Egypt in the summer of 30 BCE. His advance was rapid and largely uncontested. The legions Antony had stationed in various parts of the country went over to him without significant resistance, a pattern that had been established at Actium and continued with the consistency of a tide. He reached Pelusium, the eastern gateway to Egypt, and it surrendered. He moved toward Alexandria. Antony made one last military effort. On the 1st of August, 30 BCE, he attacked Octavian's forces outside Alexandria and initially drove them back, a brief local success that ancient sources describe as genuine, a moment when the old Antony seemed to reappear, the man who had been one of the finest field commanders of his generation. By the end of the same day, his cavalry had defected to Octavian's side, and his infantry had followed. The effort collapsed in hours. He returned to the palace and received a false report, exactly where it originated and whether it was accidental or deliberate remains unclear, that Cleopatra was dead. Antony asked his servant Eros to kill him. Eros killed himself instead. Antony then attempted to fall on his own sword, succeeded in wounding himself badly but not fatally, and lay in the palace asking to be finished while his attendants, horrified, refused. A message arrived from Cleopatra, who was not dead but was in the mausoleum with the treasury, saying that she was alive and asking him to come. He was carried there. Plutarch describes the scene with close attention and hoisted through a window because Cleopatra refused to open the doors and would not leave the interior of the mausoleum for fear of losing control of it. He died in her arms, or near enough to it that the distinction does not much matter, urging her to preserve herself and trust in Octavian's good faith, which was either an act of sincere concern or a dying man saying what he hoped was true. He was 53 years old. Octavian entered Alexandria the following day. He went first to the Mausoleum, to the tombs of the Ptolemaic kings, and to Alexander's tomb, where he was reported to have looked at the body and accidentally broken off a piece of the nose. He declined to view the tombs of the Ptolemaic kings themselves, remarking that he had come to see a king, not corpses, a line that sounds rehearsed and probably was. He agreed to meet Cleopatra. She had secured herself in the mausoleum with two of her women attendants, Eros and Charmian, whose names the sources preserve, and with the treasury. Octavian's men had made one attempt to seize her during the confusion following Antony's death, coming through the door while she was distracted, and she had attempted to stab herself with a dagger before being physically restrained. She was alive. She was in Roman custody in the sense that she could not leave the mausoleum freely, but she had not been disarmed in any meaningful sense because the combustible material surrounding the treasury remained her primary instrument of negotiation. The meeting between Cleopatra and Octavian is recorded by Plutarch at some length, and it is one of those passages where the reader is forced to be honest about the limits of what any ancient source can actually know. Plutarch is describing a private conversation between two people, one of whom died shortly afterward, and one of whom had every interest in controlling the account of it. What Plutarch gives you is a version, plausible, dramatically coherent, consistent with what both parties were likely trying to accomplish. Cleopatra presented her accounts. She had prepared a detailed record of her assets, the treasury's contents, the kingdom's revenues, the inventory of what she had brought to the mausoleum. She was demonstrating, in the language of governance that had defined her entire reign, that she was a sovereign capable of managing an estate, not simply a defeated enemy to be processed. When one of her stewards accused her, in Octavian's presence, of having withheld items from the inventory, she went for him with her hands, grabbing him, pulling his hair, the kind of physical fury that the sources note with evident surprise at its contrast with her usual composure. She told Octavian the hidden items were gifts she had set aside for Octavia and Livia, his wife, that she had been preparing to cultivate the women in his circle as a path to his goodwill. Octavian told her she should be optimistic. He spoke of preserving her position, of arrangements that could be made. He was warm, or performed warmth, in exactly the way that his correspondence during the preceding months had been warm, specific enough to encourage hope, vague enough to guarantee nothing. She did not believe him, or she believed him enough to probe the belief against the alternative evidence available to her. A man named Cornelius Dolabella, a young officer on Octavian's staff who had developed some personal sympathy for her during the preceding weeks, sent her a private message. Octavian planned to leave Egypt within 3 days. He intended to take her to Rome. She would appear in his triumph, the ceremonial procession through the city that displayed a victor's conquests. As the central exhibit, the foreign queen who had corrupted a Roman general and threatened the Roman order led through the streets in chains before the Roman public. She had watched Arsinoe in Caesar's triumph 22 years earlier. She remembered what it looked like. What happened next, on approximately the 12th of August, 30 BCE, is one of those historical events where the precise facts have been debated continuously and resolved not at all. Cleopatra ate a meal. She sent a letter to Octavian asking to be buried beside Antony. She bathed. She dressed in her royal regalia, the full formal dress of an Egyptian queen. She lay down, and she died. The method of her death is the element that has attracted the most literary and historical attention, for the obvious reason that it is the element the sources most disagree on and most embellish. The Egyptian cobra, sacred to the sun god and associated in Egyptian religious tradition with royal death, is the image that settled into the tradition and stayed there, in part because of its symbolic neatness. A queen of Egypt identified with Isis, dying by the sacred snake of her own royal iconography. Ancient sources debate whether the snake was smuggled in with figs, whether it was concealed in a basket, whether there was a snake at all. Octavian apparently had snake charmers brought to her body afterward to attempt to draw out venom, which suggests he at least entertained the snake hypothesis. There were small marks on her arm that could have been puncture wounds. There were other explanations. What is not debated is the fact of it. When Octavian's men opened the mausoleum, Cleopatra was dead on her couch in her royal dress, with Eris dead at her feet and Charmian dying beside her, still straightening the crown on Cleopatra's head when the soldiers entered. One of the soldiers, by Plutarch's account, asked Charmian if this was well done. Charmian replied that it was very well done and fitting for a queen descended from so many kings. Then she died too. Octavian was, by the source's account, frustrated and then composed. He had lost the exhibit for his triumph. He arranged a proper burial instead. Cleopatra was buried beside Antony as she had requested, in the mausoleum she had built for herself. Antyllus, Antony's son, was found and killed. Caesarion, who had almost reached the Red Sea coast, was recalled by a trusted tutor who told him it was safe to return. Whether this was genuine misunderstanding or deliberate deception is not clear, and was killed on Octavian's order when he arrived back in Alexandria. Octavian reportedly offered a justification that was brief and entirely in character. 2 Caesars, he observed, was one too many. He was 33 years old, and the world he was about to build on the ruins of the one Cleopatra had tried to preserve was going to last for centuries. But before the last chapter of this story closes, there is something that the tradition almost always forgets to tell you, because it was focused on the death and not the continuation. 3 children of Antony and Cleopatra were still alive. They had been collected, along with the treasury, and they were on their way to Rome. What happened to them, and to the dynasty's last thread, is where this story actually ends. Chapter 12: What the River Carried On. Egypt did not mourn publicly, it absorbed. That was the Ptolemaic inheritance in its final form, not a dynasty, not a throne, not a living queen in royal regalia. It was a country so ancient and so structurally self-sustaining that it continued functioning through the transition from Ptolemaic kingdom to Roman province with a smoothness that must have surprised even Octavian. The nome administrators filed their reports. The irrigation channels moved their water. The grain harvest was assessed, recorded, and dispatched. The temples performed their ceremonies. The Nile flooded in the autumn of 30 BCE, as it had flooded every autumn for 5,000 years, depositing its silt across the fields of the delta and the valley. It remained indifferent to who claimed to own what it nourished. Octavian renamed himself Augustus within a few years and set about constructing the political order that would become the Roman Empire. Egypt's place in that order was unlike any other province's, and the arrangement he made for it tells you precisely how seriously Rome understood what it had acquired. Egypt was not governed through the Senate. Every other major Roman province had a senatorial governor, a man of the appropriate rank, appointed through the conventional machinery of Roman public life, accountable to the Senate. Egypt was governed by a prefect appointed directly by Augustus himself, answerable to him alone, removable by him alone. No senator was permitted to enter Egypt without the emperor's explicit personal permission. The reason was the grain. Egypt fed Rome, not metaphorically, but literally and structurally. The annual shipments of Egyptian wheat that moved through Alexandria's harbor were the nutritional foundation of a city that could not feed itself from Italian soil. Whoever controlled Egypt controlled Rome's food supply, and Augustus had no intention of allowing any senator to also have unsupervised access to the instrument by which Rome could be starved into submission. Egypt was too important to be governed conventionally. It was governed instead as a personal possession of the emperor, closer in practical terms to a private estate than to a province. Augustus visited Alexandria in the days after Cleopatra's death and did what conquerors do when they need to establish their relationship to what they have conquered. He went to Alexander's tomb. He stood before the body, still preserved in the elaborate sarcophagus that the Ptolemies had maintained for 2.5 centuries. He looked at the face of the man whose corpse had founded the dynasty he had just ended. Ancient sources record that he brought flowers and a golden crown, and that he accidentally broke off a piece of the nose while leaning close to examine the features. He declined, as noted, to visit the tombs of the Ptolemaic kings. He had come to see Alexander, and Alexander he had seen. The Ptolemies were finished, and their tombs held nothing he needed. What he did not do is as significant as what he did. He did not dismantle the mausoleum. He did not close the library's operations. He did not flatten the Ptolemaic palace complex or replace Alexandria's institutional character with something more conventionally Roman. The city that had been the Ptolemies' argument for where the Mediterranean world's center should be was too valuable to vandalize. It continued as the administrative capital of the new province, as the commercial hub of the eastern grain trade, and as the intellectual center it had been for centuries. Rome simply put its name on the door. The 3 surviving children of Antony and Cleopatra were transported to Rome and placed in the household of Octavia. Consider the particular quality of this arrangement for a moment. Octavia, the woman Antony had married as a gesture of political reconciliation, the woman he had abandoned for Cleopatra, took in the children of the woman who had replaced her. She raised them alongside her own. Ancient sources remark on this with the admiration they reserved for behavior that met Roman ideals of womanly virtue. Octavia did it, apparently without visible bitterness. The three children of Alexandria grew up in a Roman household, eating Roman food, speaking Latin alongside Greek, and watching Roman public life from the inside. Alexander Helios and Ptolemy Philadelphus disappear from the sources relatively quickly. Their fates are not recorded with any confidence, and they were probably dead before reaching adulthood. The empire had no use for Ptolemaic princes who might become symbols of Egyptian dynastic continuity, and the silence around their disappearance speaks in the way that silences in ancient sources sometimes do. Cleopatra VII survived. She was approximately 10 years old when she arrived in Rome, and she appeared in Augustus's triumph, the great procession through the city that displayed the spoils of the Egyptian campaign. She walked in chains by the standard practice of triumphal displays, alongside a golden effigy of her mother. The Roman crowd, which had turned out in enormous numbers, saw a 10-year-old girl in chains beside a golden statue. Ancient sources record that the crowd's reaction was sympathetic, that the sight of the children moved people in a way that disrupted the triumph's intended tone of celebration. Augustus took note. She was educated in Octavia's household and given the upbringing of a Roman aristocratic woman, Latin, Greek, and the cultural formation appropriate to her rank. At some point in her teenage years, Augustus arranged her marriage to Juba II, the king of Mauritania. Juba II was himself a figure of Roman cultural formation. He had been brought to Rome as a child when Julius Caesar conquered Numidia, raised and educated in Rome, and given Roman citizenship. He governed a North African kingdom in the client-king tradition. The marriage of Cleopatra VII to Juba II placed a Ptolemaic princess on a North African throne again, reduced in scale, but a throne nonetheless. The coins she minted in Mauritania are among the most direct surviving expressions of her sense of identity. On some of them, she appears with the iconography of Isis, the same goddess her mother had claimed. She did not abandon this in Mauritania. She carried it with her into a Roman client kingdom on the Atlantic coast of Africa and pressed it into the metal of her coinage. It has survived 2,000 years and can be held in the hand and examined today. She and Juba II had at least one child. They named him Ptolemy. Ptolemy of Mauritania grew up, ruled his kingdom after his father's death, and maintained the client-king relationship with Rome that had structured his family's existence. He was sufficiently prominent to be invited to Rome during the reign of Caligula, and sufficiently visible in his purple robes at the games that Caligula had him killed. The specific motivation the sources offer is the purple, that Ptolemy appeared in a purple cloak more magnificent than Caligula's own, and that this display of royal identity triggered in the emperor a rage that ended the last Ptolemaic life. Whether this is literally true or a story shaped to carry a moral about the danger of being too visibly royal, it is the ending the dynasty received. The last person carrying Ptolemaic blood in the direct line was killed by a Roman emperor for wearing too much purple. A dynasty that had survived for 3 centuries was finally destroyed by being slightly too royal. In Rome, the poets had already been at work on what Cleopatra meant. Horace, in an ode written shortly after Actium, described her death as a noble act, the one moment where she rose above the degradation of her defeat. She had refused, he wrote, to be led in a proud triumph, unqueenly, had chosen death over the humiliation of appearing in chains before the Roman crowd. The ode is genuinely beautiful and almost entirely a Roman construction. Horace is praising Cleopatra for doing what Rome needed her to do, in the way Rome needed her to do it. The queen who had governed Egypt for 21 years becomes, in Horace's rendering, most admirable at the moment she stops being a political actor and becomes a poetic one. Virgil placed her in the Aeneid, briefly, on the shield of Aeneas, leading the forces of the East against Rome, surrounded by the monstrous gods of Egypt facing the clean rationality of Roman divine order. She is a symbol in Virgil, a figure in a moral geography rather than a person. The portrait served the Augustan moment and lasted considerably longer than the moment required. What the Egyptian record preserves is different and quieter. The administrative papyri from the early years of the Roman province show the same machinery running that had run under the Ptolemies, the tax collectors, the grain assessors, the scribes producing documents in Greek and Demotic Egyptian. The names at the top of the documents changed. The documents continued. The irrigation officials made their seasonal assessments of the Nile's flood level, recording whether the water had reached the marks on the nilometers. These were the same marks that had been read and recorded since the early dynasties. It was the same annual negotiation between human agriculture and the river's variable generosity. The canal system that Cleopatra had maintained and her predecessors had built over centuries kept moving water through the delta fields. The temple of Hathor at Dendera, where her image still stood on the outer wall in the pharaonic posture of offering, continued its ceremonies. Pilgrims came. Priests performed the rituals. The goddess received what the goddess was owed. The relief on the wall showed a queen making offerings in the correct posture, with the correct gestures, identified in the correct titles. And the pilgrims who passed it lived and died without knowing, or perhaps caring, that the dynasty whose last queen stood on that wall had ended 30 years before, or 50, or 100. The Nile moved south to north as it had always moved, carrying the water of the African interior down through the cataracts and across the valley and out through the delta into the Mediterranean. It had done this before the Ptolemies arrived with Alexander's body and their Macedonian ambitions. It continued doing it after the last of them died in a mausoleum with a golden crown on her head and 2 women who would not leave her. Whatever she had been, ruler, strategist, goddess identified, mother, the last sovereign of a 3-century dynasty in a world being reorganized by force, the river did not stop for her any more than it had stopped for the pharaohs who came before. It carried the silt down and spread it across the fields, and the fields produced the grain, and the grain fed the people, and the people recorded their transactions in the nome offices and paid their taxes and planted their crops in the freshly deposited earth. And the year turned, and the flood came again, and the marks on the nilometers were read by new hands and recorded in new documents, and the water moved on. The journey is complete. Rest well.